With us today, Brother Salman Tufail, who will be addressing us. At the end, we will have some questions and answers and then some Jamaat announcements. So without much further ado, it is with pleasure that I ask Brother Salman to address us, please. Yeah, I'll pin it for you.
Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. I would like to first start by thanking Allah that we have arrived safely, and hope and pray that He delivers us home tonight safely as well. I had planned a talk about Islam and modernity today, but I thought it more appropriate to focus on a more time-appropriate issue. As we know, and I was very much aware of it as I travelled down, today marks the 14th anniversary of the 7/7 bombing in London, which occurred on the 7th of July 2005. 4 suicide bombers with rucksacks full of explosives attacked central London, killing 52 people and injuring hundreds more. I know we would all like to express our deep felt sympathies and prayer to the victims and all their families who are forever in our prayers and thoughts. This despicable act was an attack on all of us, despite the extremists attempting to divide us, and we as a Jamaat will always stand with the victims and against extremists. I would like to start by sharing with you a small piece that I had read some days ago on a view expressed by a Muslim in Kenya, which is in total contradiction and in effect repudiation of the act of those who perpetrated the 7/7 atrocity. He states, "We are brothers. It is only religion that is the difference. So I ask my brother Muslims to take care of the Christians, so that the Christians also take care of us. Let us help one another and let us live together peacefully." This was a moving statement by a Salafara, a Muslim teacher, in an interview after an attack in Kenya by the Islamic militants who were separating Muslims from non-Muslims and were then killing Christians. When he, being a Muslim, was offered the chance to escape, he refused. He told the attackers, "You either kill us all or leave us alone," and travelled to Abyssinia in 615 CE. Abyssinia is the modern-day Ethiopia. There were some 84 of them, and they were given shelter and protection by the Christian king Negus. And despite a concerted effort by the opponents of the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, he would not allow them to be taken back. The king, who was a Christian king at the time, said, "Go your ways, for ye are safe in my lands. Not for the mountains of gold would I harm a single man of you." The action of Salafara was very much in line with Islamic tradition, which we love our fellow beings, and is an integral part of our practice. In some respects, this is entirely, though not always, in awareness of the covenants of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as was elucidated in the books The Covenants of the Prophet Muhammad with the Christian World by Dr. John Andrew Morrow, which was covered by Nasser Ahmed's scholarly work in a recent edition of The Hope. Moreover, it is my view that the Honourable Justice Hayden Cave unconsciously alluded to this on the 23rd of March 2018 when he sentencing the Parsons Green bomber and Ahmed Hassan, which occurred in 2017, some 12 years after the 7/7 bombings. He concludes in his judgment, "Finally, Ahmed Hassan, let me say this to you. You will have plenty of time to study the Quran in prison in the years to come. You should understand that the Quran is a book of peace. Islam is a religion of peace. Quran and Islam forbid anything extreme, including extremism in religion. Islam forbids the breaking of the law of the land where one is living as a guest. Islam forbids terrorism. The Quran and Sunnah provide that the crime of perpetrating terror to cause corruption in the land is one of the most severest of crimes. The view of the learned judge and that the religion of Islam and the Quran and is of peace is one that we have held throughout our Jamaat history. There is no justification for such acts in Islam. Islam is a religion of peace and love, and there are numerous historical events which seem to have been long forgotten and somehow hidden by today's media and history books, which I'd like to share with you today. For example, as I was traveling down today, I read an inspirational piece about a synagogue in Bradford, which I have summarized in a prose form for you all. The story unfolded as follows. The final remaining synagogue faced a tough choice. The roof of the Grade 2 listed Moorish building was leaking. There was a serious damage to the eastern wall. There was the ark that held the Torah scrolls that was damaged. There was no way the modest subscription paid annually by the 45 temple members could ever recover the costs. The synagogue's elderly administrator, Rudy Lever, reluctantly proposed the option that he least wanted to propose: to sell the beautiful 132-year-old building, forcing the Jewish congregation to go elsewhere. It was a terrible proposition, coming after the city's only Orthodox synagogue had recently closed. It was a very depressing time, having made a decision which meant that there would be no synagogue in a city for the Jewish community, which was a minority within the much larger Muslim majority. 300 of the Jewish faith compared to the 130,000 who were Muslim. But rather than being forced to close, this Reformed synagogue's future is brighter due to the intervention of the Muslim community. A fundraising effort was held by the secretary of the nearby mosque, together with the owner of the popular curry house and the local textile magnate, which secured the long-term future of the synagogue and forged a friendship between Bradford Muslims and Judaism. This binding relationship was very unexpected. It was a time when David Ward, one of the city's MPs, had the Liberal Democratic whip withdrawn over disparaging marks over the Jews. He was publicly supported by many of the Muslim constituents. George Galloway was then the Respect MP for Bradford West, which would have complicated the issue. However, the cross-cultural cooperation was warmly welcomed by Lever, who moved to the city from Berlin as a refugee. And we talk a lot about refugees these days. In 1937, "It's fantastic," he said during a joint interview with Zulfi Karim, the secretary of the mosque. "Rudy is my newfound big brother," said Karim, who is on the board of the Central Westgate Mosque a few hundred meters up the road from the synagogue. "It makes me proud that we can protect our neighbors." That's very important, that we can protect our neighbors. And at the same time preserve an important part of the Bradford cultural history. It was actually only after getting involved in saving the synagogue that Karim learned that the mill where his father worked, after emigrating from Pakistan in 1960, was run by a Jewish descendant of Joseph Strauss, the rabbi who founded the synagogue in 1880. Now these two men get on so well. When Lever goes on holiday, he actually gives the synagogue keys to Karim, as well as the alarm code. Wow. They have begun what they hope will be a lasting tradition, whereby the Jewish community invites the local Muslims and Christians to Shabbat, that's the Friday dinner, and the Muslims return the invitation for Ramazan feast and the Christians during Harvest Festival. This interaction, in my view, is breathtaking. If only we could learn to replicate this in our society. How different the society would be. It's what I call a wow moment. The irony is that the interaction happened some 10 miles from where some of the 7/7 bombers lived in Leeds. I now move to Europe. Has anybody heard of the Imam of the Paris Mosque during World War II? I doubt it. Imam Bangabrit, I think his name was. I know my daughters, I guess, would not have, and I don't think most younger people have ever heard of him. He was a French Algerian who was a head imam at the Paris Mosque at a time when racist fanaticism raged under the Nazi rule. He and others risked their lives to save Jews. We never hear about that Muslims saving Jews. He arranged forged documents for some of the Jewish refugees that verified their Muslim roots, thereby saving them from deportation to a concentration camp. It remains uncertain how many Jews he saved, but it could have been up to 2,000 individuals, which included not only resistance fighters, but also large numbers of women and children. In my view, the Imam was guided by the Islamic principle written in the Quran, Surah 5, verse 32, whoever saves one life, it is written that he saves all humanity. It is important to note there are similar texts, Jewish texts as well, which state, whoever destroys a single life is considered by the scriptures to have destroyed the whole world, and whoever saves a single life is considered by the scriptures to have saved the whole world. These type of courageous acts have long been forgotten by both the West and the Muslims for their own reasons. Incidentally, the mosque in Paris was opened in 1926 and was constructed as a gesture of gratitude to those Muslims who fought against the Germans in World War I. In the Great War, some 70 to 100,000 Muslims died serving under the French flag. This contribution to France by Muslims is lost sometimes in the dialogue of Muslim terrorism and banning of the hijab. Sadly, the Middle East conflict is often quite unilaterally portrayed as a religious war, yet long and frequent historical events in which Jews and Muslims have lived peacefully together, both in the East as well as the West, demonstrate how far this could be from the truth. Examples of coexistence, even mutual aid, are however less well known than those that supposedly affirm eternal clash of cultures. I now move on to Albanian history. In Albania, there are many stories which remain forgotten, such as the journey of the Alagem family, who were a Jewish family fleeing the persecution from the Nazis. I have again summarized it, and it reads as follows. Aaron Alagem was 10 years old in 1943 when he and his parents, Nissim and Sarah Alagem, fled Bulgaria to Albania. They were caught by 5 Albanian police officers who were working for the occupational force. But instead of turning them over to the occupation authorities, the Albanian policemen turned the terrified Jews over to an Albanian called Nuro Hoxha, who was a Muslim teacher and a religious man. Despite the fact that it was a major Muslim holiday coming up, he closed his shop at one of the busiest times of the year and moved the Alagem family into his home, vacating a bedroom for the use. Nuro, eldest son Sazan, later recalled what that time was like. He says, I remember those terrible times when the Nazis moved into our hometown and the Jews went into hiding. I was 10 years old. My father sheltered the 4 Jewish families, and they all were his friends, and I remember my father's words to those he took in. Now we are one family. You won't suffer any evil. My sons and I will defend you against the peril at the cost of our lives. We hid these families in underground bunkers that extended from our large house. And all the inhabitants of our hometown were anti-fascist, and all knew that many families were sheltering Jews, but none of the people in the town ever gave them up to the Nazis. There are so many historical events and incidents that sort of give a true light of Muslims, which we never really hear about. There's the work of Asma Jahangir in Pakistan, who died last year and has left a powerful legacy in defending the rights of minorities. She and her sister Hina Jalani successfully defended 2 Christian teenagers, Salamat Masih and Rahmat Masih, in their appeals against death sentences for blasphemy. Asma Jahangir and the accused faced threats of violence throughout the case, At one point, she was shouted down by an angry mob. Her car was smashed as she attempted to leave the court. The intimidation and pressure was immense. Another man who took great risks in Paris during the Second World War was Abdul Hussein Sadari. At the time, he was the head of Iranian consulate in Paris. He was able to save around 200 to 2,000 Iranian Jews then living in France. The point I am making is not that Muslims are the only group that are engaged in these sacrifices, but there is a common principle that binds us all, whatever our faith and background. We must adhere to the principles laid down by the Holy Quran and the life of the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, and continue to propagate the legacy of the Holy Prophet's peace be upon him. This principle and area of talks are so vast, one cannot do it justice in some 20 minutes. For example, there's a Medina Charter, the covenants with the Christians world with the Holy Prophet. And there is just not the time to discuss. Perhaps some more scholarly people in the Jamaat could discuss these issues. I will end the talk by sharing a piece and thoughts of Sean White when discussing the Medina Charter. The Medina Charter reflects pluralism both in content and in the history of the document. The Prophet, as clause 25 states, never imposed Islam on the people of Medina, which meant that they could still practice without disruption to their religion and custom and aspects to their life. He did not create an ummah through denouncing all ways of life except Islam, or by recognizing Islam as a singular religion. Instead, he united all the inhabitants of the city under one banner of ethical living and moral principles, commonalities between all human beings and religion. The Medina Charter is arguably the first constitution ever written incorporating religion and politics. And even though the politics of the regions have changed since it was written in recent times for the worse, Islam's values have continued to spread and are lived throughout the whole Muslim world. Despite the hold of power that some governments still have over the people, the true face of Islam shines through in how people live, communicate and approach life. He goes on to say that he speaks from personal experience, and he says, when I traveled through Iran, Turkey and northern Iraq in January of 2010, and despite what the media had to say about the people in these lands, my time there was spent in the houses of complete strangers who showered me with hospitality and transcended any experience that I'd ever had before. And although the governing body has changed, the points of the Medina Charter and tenets of Islam preached by the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, still exist amongst the people. My heritage was accepted with curiosity and respect, just as the Prophet implemented in Medina between the tribes. I was exposed to mainstream Islam, which we hear so little about in the West, and due to the confusion which unjustly joins Islam and terrorism together, I saw a tolerant Muslims who saw me as another person who wanted peace and respect and not treachery. This is what the Prophet, peace be upon him, accomplished in Medina, a community which was not based upon religion or ethnicity, but one built on unity and acceptance, one built on tolerance, one built on peace. It seems that the Prophet was aware that spirituality and faith cannot be governed, and for this reason alone he sought unity and respect as opposed to discrimination between tribes and their beliefs. Thank you.
I think I heard about that.
Do you want to take over?
No, you have to make your announcements and things because this is being broadcast.
Okay,
So it can only be about the lecture.
yes, and if I'm going to say anything about management issues, then we will. I'll say we'll close today. Yeah?
Imam used to be very, very good with the Nazis, so yes, hello, and then he used to be.
Thank you so much, Brother Salman, for your very detailed and very simply put presentation. It encompasses quite a lot of Islamic history and how Muslims should live with non-Muslims in today's society. Unfortunately, that's not what we see. And we only have to look at the refugee crisis in Africa and to see where all these Muslims are coming to. They're not going to Saudi Arabia. They're not going to Iran. They're coming to Europe for refuge again. So the cycle keeps going on like this. So thank you for your very aptly timed delivery and detailed presentation. Any questions from anyone? It is the time where you can contribute, ask questions, or add something to today's lecture. This session is all about educating ourselves as a Jamaat. Any contributions from our young ladies?
They're all asleep.
Are you all just eagerly awaiting your sandwiches and tea?
Yes.
Yes.
How is it possible to disseminate this information to Muslims, Christians, just to other groups?
Okay.
How can we make it known? Because a lot of what he said I didn't know either, especially.
Okay. So as part of this Jamaat, we have the Light and the Islamic and the Hope magazine, which we will publish his lecture in today. It's being broadcast as well. And one of the interesting things the Prophet said, he said, if you want to know a man's character, ask his neighbor. So if we take into consideration what was said today, and we live it in our daily lives, then we become embodiments of what has been said today. And this is what I learned from my parents. To the fact that someone passed away in our community where we live. And I did what I saw my father do, which is you make sure you provide the food and you take some shopping and so on. And it was an English person who passed away. And to them, this is strange. So they said to me, why are you doing this? I said, well, this is what I saw my father did. You are in a time of distress. And as Muslims, it is our duty to step in and help you. And they were overwhelmed by this. So as I said, the Prophet said, if you want to know a man's character, ask his neighbor. If what has been said today, if what our ancestors has stood and died and lived for means anything to any one of us, all we need to do is walk in their footsteps. What greater example could you be or could you want? Sorry.
The difficulty is this, that there are noble examples of sacrifice to save other communities. I know of a Hindu in Jammu who was left behind by his family when Muslims were trying to kill Hindus in 1947 and they were trying to flee. And he somehow managed to get to Lahore by following the train track. And there, accidentally, he met one of his class fellows from Jammu who'd migrated to save his life and come to Pakistan. Now look at the situation. This family had been attacked by Hindus who tried to kill them, and they'd escaped Jammu and come to Lahore for safety. And they saw this young man, and his father immediately grabbed him and said, you know, what are you doing here? Took him home, and he hid him for 2 weeks, and then gave him some provisions and that kind of thing, and told him where he had to go, and he took him to the border and this kind of thing. But what you have to contrast is that as a community, although they were, this was a very gallant act. At a time when Muslims are killing Hindus for someone to save someone, particularly when he had himself escaped from the perpetrators of the same religion. But the point is this is an individual act. As a community, we were going round killing people. I mean, this Imam that you mentioned, I mentioned in a press release and several letters to newspapers to say that, look, you know, you have Schindler's List. Why doesn't anyone make a movie about this Muslim Imam saving hundreds of Jews? And there was also a Muslim in Libya who did something similar. But the difficulty is, you see, that when Muslims are approached, scholars and so on are approached, they always talk about killing other communities. What will the Messiah do when he comes down? What will the Mahdi do when he comes down? He'll wield his sword to the right and kill all non-Muslims. He'll wield his sword to the left and kill all non-Muslims. And this is where Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad Sahib was walking in the footsteps of the Holy Prophet Muhammad. Holy Prophet Muhammad got to Medina. You talked about Misaq-e-Medina, Constitution of Medina. Who was that agreement with? What was the majority living in Medina? Jews. So he entered into a treaty with Jews. There were some Christians as well, but mostly Jews, to say that, you know, you are free to practice your religion, you are free to preach your religion, no one's going to force you to become Islam, things that you were referring to and so on. And people respected that. But today you show the slightest sympathy to a Jew who's lying on the ground, bleeding to death, and even if you just ring 999 and people find out a Muslim rang 999, you become an agent of a Zionist agent and an agent of Israel. And this is our difficulty. Hazrat Sahib himself, he made an offer to, for example, to the Hindus of India. He said, look, you hold cow to be sacred. And when a cow is slaughtered, it upsets you. So my Jamaat and I, we enter into a voluntary agreement with you that we will not slaughter cow. Now in return, what are you going to do to make sure that there is peace between Hindus and Muslims? And he said, I urge you to stop writing derogatory comments about the Holy Prophet Muhammad. He said, I'm not saying become Muslims. He said, I'm not saying don't ask questions or even criticize, but be moderate in your language when you do that. So we'll give an answer. He was the first person to approach the Viceroy of India with what? You know, this act that the British government has passed about hate speech? He proposed that in 1901. And it's taken the British government 110 years to see. Let me ask you, what was it that the Messiah was going to do?
Break the cross, kill the swine.
Yeah, well, exactly, literally.
Yes.
But the point was that the Messiah was going to establish the intellectual superiority of Islam over other things. And what Hazrat Sahib proposed in 1900, the British government saw the sense of it 110 years later.
18 years.
180, sorry. Others' mathematics is better than mine, you know. So 118 years later. And that is the point that I make, and I wonder if it's taking the British government 118 years to get to this point, how much longer will it take our Muslim brothers and sisters? These are wonderful and glorious examples. But I know someone in Rawalpindi, he's 80 years old now, who told me that they left their town in 1947 to get to Pakistan. They were asleep and there was an attack by Hindus and Sikhs, and his parents died. And he was about 4 or so he was just wandering, crying. And another Muslim family just adopted him. They said, don't cry, just come with us. And they got closer to the border, and they saw this house, and they mistook it for a Muslim's house. So they knocked on the door, and it was Sikhs. And they called them in. And they said, are you mad? You're standing out in the open. Someone will kill you. And they took them in. And they dug like a trench. And they covered the trench up with something, so it wasn't obvious. And hid this whole family in that trench. Now, that is a gallant act. When their co-religionists were going around slaughtering Muslims, they take, this family in, and they give them refuge, and then they took them to the border and made sure they crossed safely and so on. So these people, the guy I met in Jammu and this gentleman in Rawalpindi, they always regret that they've never been able to go back and meet those people again and thank them and, and see them and so on. But the point is that as a community, our political leaders need to make these announcements. As someone said, I think you said, why is it that when there's a problem in Iraq or Syria, people don't go to Saudi Arabia or Emirates? They're rich countries, they're not poor countries. Why do they say we want to go to France, Germany, England, and so on? What reason is there? One reason is that apart from safety and security, they know they have freedom of conscience and freedom of religion, freedom of thought and freedom of practice. And what was it that the Holy Prophet Muhammad promised to the Jews and Christians of Medina? Freedom of religion, freedom of preaching and practicing religion, safety and security. You see, people who, someone came to me, a Maulana, he wanted British nationality. So I said, fine, So I was filling the questionnaire. Do you support terrorism? No, of course not. Toba, 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 astaghfar, astaghfar. It is un-Islam. So I said, well, okay. That bomb blast in Israel the other day, do you support it or oppose it? Well, that's not terrorism. That is freedom fighters. So I said, well, what's happening in Kashmir? Do you support it or? And he said to me, you ask very hard questions. I said, this is not me asking. This is the British government asking you. You are making a statement on oath that I do not support terrorism. They don't want your definition of terrorism. They're using their own definition of terrorism. And so I asked him, what will you do? Well, in fact, what I said to him, I said, look, I've completed it, you take it away. I'm not going to take it any further and get involved, and you send it to the Home Office and so on. And if you have any problems, I'll guide you. But I can't be involved in this sort of duplicity is the only word for it. But I said to him, when you get British nationality, you'll be required to take an oath. An oath of loyalty and obedience to the British Queen. So I said, if she says, go and attack Saudi Arabia, you'll have to attack it. Go and attack Pakistan, you have to attack it. Go and attack Iraq, as the British did, including the Muslims in the British army. You will have to do it. And he looked at me. and he got his British nationality. And he went to the oath-taking ceremony, and he put his hand on the Quran, and he promised to obey the British Queen, whatever she asks him to do. And that is the difficulty. And Ahmadi would say, the Holy Quran says, obey Allah, obey the Prophet, and obey your rulers, as long as they're not interfering in your religion. And I will end by telling you a story about
Another story.
another story.
Question. There is no doubt.
You're the speaker, how come you're asking questions? We should be asking you questions.
No, you're not going to bring something about citizenship, which I was going to speak about. There is no doubt historically the Prophet was involved in military conflict.
Yep,
Yes?
that's right.
He was not a pacifist. When he,
Agree?
you see, there lies some issues of this thing about where that Maulvi, he misinformed, that Maulana. But there is no doubt he went to war.
That's right.
So sometimes there is an element where we can defend ourselves.
Yeah,
And I think
oh,
that's
agreed,
like-
agreed. We are not being pacifists. We are not saying turn the other cheek.
Yeah. But it's very interesting you mentioned something about the citizenship. You see, I came across the Maulana Sadruddin, and there was an article, I read a research paper about him in 1915. He was complaining to the British government, who thought he was a mischief maker because he was complaining.
I was going to say, did you know that the British
Yeah.
authorities actually hated him?
Hate him, but
That troublesome Maulvi.
yes, but the researcher says that the thing that he never let go of the fact that he was citizen of the under the Queen. He says that I don't want to get the king in trouble. He's always thinking about his citizenship, and that person talks about the Britishness of Sadruddin. Maulana Sadruddin is very, very interesting. I only came across that as I was researching.
Yeah.
Very fascinating, and as I said, the researcher doesn't say that he is complaining, them against us. He's actually complaining as a person under the authorities of the British.
We've carried on with that. When we talk about Sharia, over the last 40 years, our efforts have meant that substantial changes have been made to British law to bring it closer to Sharia. We haven't gone out in the streets and waved guns about or used iron bars to attack shops and all this kind of thing. Long time ago, there used to be a law, if you didn't pay your mortgage installments, after 3 installments, the bank or the building society went to court. The court said, get out, give the keys to the bank, and that was the end of the story. Now what does the Quran say? If someone owes you money,
Give him time.
and he's in strained financial circumstances, be soft. Give him time. Best if you write off the loan, but give him time. And after the almost complete collapse of the economic system, certainly the housing market, what did the British government do? They said to the courts, give them time. But they didn't just say that. It was a campaign in which the Jamaat was involved, of writing letters, signing petitions, doing this, doing that. Again, many boys and girls, and I stress this, boys as well, were being forced into marriages back in Pakistan. And the Jamaat was part of a sustained campaign to say this is un-Islamic, change the law. And the government has changed the law, and now forced marriages are actually a criminal offense. And there are other things, gambling. There was a time a few years ago when the minimum limit on how much you could put into a one-armed bandit was £100. So Jamaat was part of a campaign that said this is ludicrous. All these shops are in deprived areas. They're not in Mayfair or Windsor or Knightsbridge. Why are in those deprived areas? Because these guys are playing on people's deprivation. I've only got £5. That's not enough to feed my kids. Let me take a chance. Let me put it in the one-armed bandit. Maybe I'll win 30 quid and that'll be enough to feed my family. And the government changed that maximum limit from £100 to how much? £2. And Ladbrokes are complaining that that means closure of 100 of their shops, and that will put, a lot of people out of work. And I said that's akin to you arresting a heroin smuggler and putting him in jail, and the heroin smuggler complaining that because you put me in jail, all these people that I employed overseas to grow this heroin, manufacture this heroin, smuggle it into UK for me, they are now all going to lose their jobs and their families are going to starve. So, and that is the thing, we've carried on along. Hazrat Khwaja Kamaluddin Sahib, he was a British citizen right after the First World War. As a British citizen, he fought for Khilafat to be retained in Turkey, which is something very courageous. Your country has just fought a war against them, defeated them, and now you're asking the British to treat them leniently and retain their system of government. He didn't succeed, but the point is the intention. And this is the thing, that although we say we are Sunnis and we should follow the example of the Holy Prophet Muhammad and so on, we don't. The example that you set out, is in addition to the Constitution of Medina, there are specific contracts between the Holy Prophet Muhammad and Christians, 14 of them. If a church is damaged or destroyed in a country where Muslims are in a majority, he said, I make it a duty until the day of judgment for the Muslims, for the Muslim government to actually repair and renovate that church at their own cost. This was the agreement he made. And what these guys did that you mentioned with this synagogue is actually following along the path set out by the Holy Prophet. And look how successful he was.
But they got a lot of stick for it as well. Some of them got a lot of stick.
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, I would have guessed that. There are other examples. In Calcutta, I think it is, there's only one synagogue left because most Jews have migrated to Israel. And who's responsible for its upkeep? It's a Muslim. He's making sure that the building doesn't fall down, and he sent money presumably by the people who migrated and so on. But it needs someone with courage like Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad to stand up and say that, look, unless you change your habits and the way you behave, then you're going to forever be at the bottom of the pile. I mean, take anything. I was in education. Who's at the bottom of the list? Muslims. And you see, look at their mentality. I went to the local mosque and I said, look, Muslims are at the bottom of the pile. And they said, well, yes, we're very concerned. And I said, what are you doing about it? Actually, it was a trustee. And he just looked at me and he said, well, what can we do? And I said, well, if you put up a whiteboard and give me a few markers, I will come and give free lessons in mathematics and science and English on Saturday and Sunday. He said, that's a very good idea. And then I waited And I waited, and I'm still waiting, and I was never contacted. So I rang him and I said, look, I'm sitting at home on Saturday and Sunday waiting for you. What happened? And he said, well, everyone appreciated your offer, but they said it's a question of religion. So I said to him, did I offer to teach them Islamic studies or how to pray? How is physics taught by an Ahmadi different from physics taught by a Sunni? And he and ahed, and then I said to him, please ask your committee one question. I don't want to argue about it, but please ask them one question. The headmaster and the majority of teachers in that school where Muslims go are Sikhs. So presumably Ahmadis are worse than Sikhs, that they can learn mathematics and English and science from Sikhs, but not from Ahmadis. Now, until we change that kind of mentality, and that mentality will only change if the religious and political leadership has the courage to say. And that's the point about this is why men come from God. That Hazrat Sahib had, he said, well, if you all want to leave me, what do I care? How big a Jamaat I have. I'm going to speak the truth, and I'm going to tell you what the Holy Prophet's real teaching was. You want to follow it, follow it. You don't want to follow it, don't follow it. But my consideration is not going to be how many people I'm going to upset and how many people are going to leave the Jamaat and how many people are going to join or not join or whatever. And I think we've had long enough on this topic. If you can send me the text of your thing, we'll print it in the line. Yes. So with that, I think we've come to a close of our broadcast. Our secretary has some announcements and things to make, which are to do with the Jamaat. So as I close down, then Mustaq will be speaking to you about our plans for Eid al-Adha and our conference in August and all that kind of thing.